Hello, welcome. It's nice to see you. Welcome to our next NAPS. NAPS stands Nonprofit Auditor Points, and my name is Irina Wyshkova, your nonprofit auditor. I design NAPS to help nonprofit community to have a discussion about accounting and auditing issues. Hopefully, these short videos will help accounting management, executive director, bookkeepers, and other folks involved in understanding financial statements for nonprofits to better understand the accrual method of accounting and understand general accepted accounting principles. These videos are not designed to be authoritative. Again, they just simply me sharing experience as an auditor. Let's talk about net assets today. We're going to talk about net assets with donor restriction and without the donor restrictions. We used to have different terminology: temporarily restricted net assets, permanently restricted net assets, and unrestricted net assets. That terminology is no longer in use. Just simply we have two buckets. It's net assets with donor restrictions and net assets without donor restrictions. What is net assets? Net assets is equity. Like if you understand for profit accounting, equity meaning it's all earnings from inception of the entity up until specific period of time that the entity accumulated. Same with nonprofits. Net assets, we can call it cushion or reserve that nonprofit accumulated from inception up until the point that we're looking at. Ideally, it is suggested that organization has about 6 to 9 months of reserve in their net assets. However, not all net assets are the same. As I mentioned just now, there are two buckets in net assets: net assets with donor restrictions and net assets without donor restrictions. So net assets without donor restrictions are assets that management and board can spend it for any purposes within the organization mission that the organization needs. For example, it can be spent for administrative purposes, for fundraising, for purchasing fixed assets, for general program expenses, for anything, as long as it's in accordance with the organization of the mission. And it's very critical because when nonprofit is formed, it declares the mission. For example, nonprofit can declare a mission of saving specific type of birds. This is their mission. They declare that mission, they put it in their articles of incorporation, they declare to the public as a public charity that they're collecting funds from donors to achieve that mission. Therefore, nonprofit can only spend funds for that purpose, for that mission. And as long as nonprofits receive funds from donors without any more specific than that restriction, that's going to be net assets without a donor restriction, and nonprofit can spend money for anything that the organization needs within its mission. Another bucket is net assets with donor restriction. So now, when the organization declared the mission, for example, to save very rare species of birds in California, and it's just very broad, just rare species of birds in California. But if the donor gave funds and specifically said that they want to preserve bird type XYZ, then it becomes more narrower than the mission that they declared by nonprofit. Therefore, these specific funds will be restricted by purpose. So donor can give funds that are restricted either by purpose or by time. And that will be net assets with donor restrictions. Example of restriction by time: donor can give a grant for the saving this type of birds that will be spent within next 3 years, needs to be spent within next 3 years, and it will be restricted by time then. So this is 2 buckets. However, inside these buckets, the net assets can also be segregated. So in this video, we're going to talk about net assets without donor restrictions and what other criteria can be used within that bucket. Even though the funds without a donor restriction, board as a governing body can create board designated funds. Again, the board can decide what kind of designation they want to put. For example, they might want to create a reserve, maybe for future building that the nonprofit would like to buy. So board has ability to designate these funds for any purpose they believe the organization will need. However, it's still going to be within net assets without donor restrictions, but there will be board designated funds. And this designation needs to be presented on financial statements and the purpose of designation. But because money comes from unrestricted sources, meaning they were never restricted by donors, the board can undesignate them later. So it's really up to the board if they want to designate or release from designation, how they want to spend funds. But again, they will be inside net assets without a donor restriction. Additionally, board can create quasi-endowment fund from net assets without donor restrictions. It will be also, in a sense, permanent funds, but they're called quasi-endowment because they're really not truly endowment fund that typically created from donor restricted funds, because these funds came from unrestricted sources, investments, unrestricted donations. The board needs to formally create endowment fund, develop the policy, how the fund going to be used, when it can be spent, and where it will be invested, and so forth. However, again, because it's a discretion of the board can decide or reallocate the use of the funds, even from quasi-endowment fund. So, to summarize, there are in net assets for nonprofits, there are 2 buckets: net assets with donor restrictions and net assets without donor restrictions. Restriction only comes from donors, meaning outside, and the board cannot change that designation because it comes from the donor. However, net assets without donor restrictions can also have a different setting. There could be designated net assets, comes from net assets without donor restrictions, when the board can simply designate some funds for whatever purposes they decide in future will require nonprofit. Another more formal way for the board to create the designation would be quasi-endowment fund, which also created from net assets without the donor restrictions, but it's more formal, and nonprofit board will need to create the policy about investment of these funds, spending of the funds, maintenance, and overall setting of this quasi-endowment fund. But again, because they're under discretion of the board, it's up to the board to spend the fund or create the fund. And in the next step, we're going to talk about net assets with donor restrictions. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon. Bye.